What if the reunification of Korea didn't arrive as a historic triumph, but as a crisis South Korea had cornered itself into? Consider this. If North Korea were to collapse tomorrow, there would be no room for debate or referendum. South Korea's reunification policy means that it would face enormous pressure, domestically and internationally, to take responsibility for the 25 million newly repatriated citizens, regardless of South Korea's capacity to absorb them. This vulnerability is real, but it's rarely how reunification is seen. For decades, Koreans have held on to the belief that reunifying the country is a matter of destiny, prosperity, and national restoration. In South Korea, it's more than an aspiration. Reunification is a constitutionally enshrined duty which continues to shape policy, along with its costs and risks. So then, given its political implications, the reunification goal must be judged on its viability as a policy objective. This raises two questions.
You don't get to ask those questions.
First, is reunification even possible? If it's highly unlikely in the long term, then the costs of maintaining the goal would require especially strong justifications. And second, if reunification were somehow achieved, would it even be desirable? In other words, would the costs be worth the benefits? Desirability matters because 1. South Korea continues to devote resources to reunification planning and policy, and 2. Maintaining the goal creates vulnerabilities to sudden, unexpected reunification. No matter how unlikely, it makes little sense to leave open such a possibility unless reunification is clearly beneficial, or at the very least, not devastatingly harmful. But before I answer these questions, it's important to understand in a bit more detail why reunification is so appealing and has a near sacred significance for Koreans. First, there's a moral and symbolic element. After all, almost immediately following decades of brutal Japanese colonization, the country was split in half as it became caught up in great power politics. For a people who had long understood themselves as a single civilization, the division became a traumatic rupture in their sense of national continuity. Second, there's a prospect of immense economic gains. The Korean peninsula was essentially flattened during the Korean War. From the ground up and in a single generation, South Korea reached high income status, leads in high-tech industry, and has become a cultural powerhouse. That's just with one half of the country. Goldman Sachs once estimated that a unified Korea could even rise to the ranks of the world's great powers. When considering such things, it can be easy to assume that a unified Korea, pooling its manpower and resources, not only would be more prosperous and influential, but also the natural correction to a painful historical juncture. Right?
Stop the cap!
Well, it's emotionally appealing for sure. But how does South Korea's reunification goal hold up as a policy objective? First, is it even possible? Korean reunification can happen either through military conflict or through peaceful political processes. Neither pathway is plausible.
Nope.
Reunification through war is extremely unlikely because, simply put, neither side of the Korean peninsula believes it can win against the other. The bargaining theory of war helps explain why this is the case. The theory begins from a simple premise. Because war is inherently costly and destructive, there should be some range of diplomatic solutions that both sides can agree is better than waging war. So then, why does war occur? The theory holds that peaceful bargaining fails due to information problems or commitment problems. Information problems arise when one or both sides misjudge the other's capabilities or willingness to fight, leading them to overestimate the chances of victory at an acceptable cost. In Korea, such problems are minimal. North Korea is well aware that invading the South is tantamount to regime suicide. This has been the case since at least the 1990s. The North's military budget and conventional capabilities have long been dwarfed by those of South Korea, which is further backed by a formal alliance with the United States. The US and South Korea's frequent large-scale joint military exercises is just one of the ways they demonstrate their preponderant power and signal their readiness to North Korea. Given this power asymmetry, one might expect the United States and South Korea to consider invading the North to eliminate a persistent security threat. Yet, the alliance also recognized that military victory is far from guaranteed, and that the cost would be unacceptable anyways. First, History has taught us that weaker states can resist much stronger adversaries when they're willing to absorb higher costs. North Korea demonstrated such resolve during the Korean War and continues to signal it through extraordinarily high military spending relative to GDP and extreme militarization of society. Second, North Korea possesses nuclear weapons and regularly tests missiles to demonstrate its ability to strike both South Korea and the United States. It's also announced automated retaliation procedures designed to deter even limited leadership decapitation attempts. Finally, North Korea maintains security alliances with China and, more recently, Russia, both of which could plausibly intervene in the event of a defensive war.
Hell no, man. What the fuck?
Although, commitment problems can provide another pathway to war. These arise when no credible guarantee can be made that one side will refrain from exploiting future power advantages. When power is shifting rapidly, this can incentivize preemptive war. States may choose to fight now before their position worsens. While commitment problems do exist in Korea, they're largely stable. One prominent example centers on denuclearization. While the US and South Korea desperately wants North Korea to denuclearize, they haven't been able to convince them that they won't do regime change the moment they get rid of their nukes. However, commitment problems alone don't incentivize war. North Korea already possess nukes, and there's no plausible way to forcibly disarm them. Both sides are stuck in the stalemate. More broadly, there's little evidence of future shifts in the balance of power significant enough to incentivize war. South Korea and the United States remain decisively stronger, and North Korea lacks a realistic pathway to close the gap. Okay, so neither side is likely to initiate war, let alone pursue invasion and conquest as a route to reunification. Next, if reunification were to occur peacefully, it could either be asymmetric unification, where both sides negotiate the outcome as equals, or asymmetric absorption, in which one state is dismantled and incorporated into the other. Symmetric reunification has been pursued through models such as confederation or a commonwealth, but these efforts have repeatedly failed and remain unrealistic. The core obstacle is the fundamentally opposing and mutually exclusive conceptions of the Korean nation held by the North and the South. In other words, neither side can accept the survival of the other in a unified Korea. Reunification in general relies on appeals to a shared Korean ethnic and national identity. In practice, this assumption clashes with the reality of two completely distinct and oppositional state identities. These identities were forged through a devastating war and decades of ideological competition, with each side portraying itself as the sole legitimate Korea. South Korea's founding identity was essentially just anti-communism and continues to regard North Korea as illegitimate. North Korea, founded on socialist and anti-imperialist principles, views South Korea as just a puppet of the United States. Although these identities have evolved, their oppositional core has become deeply institutionalized. Education systems, propaganda, and legal frameworks on both sides reinforce mutual hostility, non-recognition of sovereignty, and the criminalization of support for the other.
Oh my God!
The near-total isolation imposed from both sides further limits opportunities for humanizing contact. These antagonistic identity constructs fundamentally shape how reunification is understood. Because the other side is seen as illegitimate, threatening, or sometimes even inherently evil, reunification necessitates the eventual dismantling and absorption. For both Koreas, fully achieving reunification ultimately implies the elimination of the other state. Under these conditions, the concessions inherent in symmetric unification amplify rather than alleviate security fears. Increased contact and institutional integration are perceived less as confidence-building measures than as opportunities for subversion and long-term domination. Put another way, in Korea, symmetric unification represents a Trojan horse, rather than a permanent political settlement. Okay then, that leaves just one more pathway to reunification: absorption.
Okay.
Because neither Korean state can be expected to voluntarily dissolve itself, absorption would require the collapse of one side. South Korea is extremely unlikely to collapse. They have their fair share of problems, but it's secured its position as a prosperous middle power with global influence, enjoying security guarantees from allies such as the US and Japan. On the other hand, North Korea is often portrayed as perpetually on the brink of collapse. Predictions of imminent regime failure has been repeated for decades. Yet, the country has proven remarkably resilient, surviving famine, natural disasters, and sustained international sanctions. If anything, North Korea's survivability is only increasing. Sanctions have proven ineffective in inducing compliance or collapse, with the North Korean economy actually showing signs of modest growth despite them. Its military capabilities, both nuclear and conventional, continue to expand. North Korea also has powerful allies in China and Russia that have interests in their survival. To summarize, war is catastrophically costly, symmetric unification can't be trusted, and absorption depends on a collapse which just isn't likely to occur. And the barriers to reunification are structural, meaning reunification is not just unlikely today, but for the long term. Then, as long as South Korea continues to invest in such an unrealistic objective and keeps unexpected reunification within the realm of possibility, the outcome must be desirable, or at the very least, not harmful.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It's one thing to pursue an unrealistic objective, it's another if realizing that objective means disaster. That brings us to the question of costs. At some point, the economic and social burdens of reunification outweigh its benefits. We know such a threshold exists because concerns over costs have already driven declining enthusiasm for reunification, particularly among younger South Koreans who face an increasingly competitive society. So, to decide whether reunification would be desirable, we need to ask a simple but unavoidable question. What would it actually cost? The German reunification experience provides a useful lower-bound cost estimate for Korea. Although peaceful and considered an overall success, it imposed enormous economic burdens and left enduring social grievances. In Korea, where the developmental gaps are deeper, institutional incompatibility is greater, and the economy is more fragile, absorption of the North would be catastrophic. German reunification involved the much wealthier, capitalist West Germany rapidly absorb a collapsing socialist East Germany. It triggered an immediate and severe economic shock to the East. Almost overnight, the East's centrally planned economy was exposed to West German and international market competition. Around 80% of East German industrial output disappeared, as state enterprises were rapidly privatized or liquidated, and roughly 3.5 million workers lost their jobs. The economic union resulted in the loss of around a half of East German household savings and an overall fall in disposable incomes. The social consequences for East Germans were devastating. Birth rates dropped by 60%, marriage rates halved, and death rates for certain age groups rose by 25%. Such changes were unseen outside of war. But it wasn't just the East Germans that suffered. For the West Germans, that bore most of the financial burden of reunification, the strain was immense. Major costs included restructuring East German state enterprises, absorbing their external debts, and providing welfare for millions of East Germans. To pay for all this, West Germany relied on heavy public borrowing, supplemented by tax increases. Ultimately, the economy fell into a recession, followed by decades of stagnation, earning Germany the label of sick man of Europe. While eventually the German economy recovered and East German living standards started to improve, East-West inequalities and generational scars remain visible decades later. What's concerning for Korea is that reunification would involve both much higher costs and a substantially weaker capacity to absorb them.
Hell no, man. What the fuck?
On the cost side, North Korea's economy is even less compatible with market capitalism than East Germany's was, and the developmental gap between North and South Korea is far wider than that between East and West Germany. A rapid German-style reunification would therefore generate an even greater economic shock in North Korea and require higher investment and welfare spending to integrate it into the South. At the same time, South Korea has a much weaker capacity to absorb these costs. The smaller population gap between North and South Korea implies more than twice the dependency burden on South Korean taxpayers than that faced by West Germans. Moreover, South Korea's economic structure is more fragile. the South Korean economy is characterized by limited industrial diversification and export dependence, together implying greater revenue volatility. South Korea also lacks any comparable regional burden-sharing mechanisms to those enjoyed by West Germany through the European monetary system. Finally, whereas Germany entered reunification with a relatively stable demographic profile, South Korea, by contrast, faces a severe demographic crisis. Even without reunification, economists warn of a permanent recession by 2040.
Hell no, man. What the fuck?
Reunification would likely raise living costs, depress fertility further, and intensify this crisis.
Terrorists win.
Although, some of you might push back and say a more gradual absorption can make the costs manageable for South Korea, by allowing North Korea to remain stable throughout an extended transition period where it would implement incremental reforms until it was ready for complete integration with the South, and thereby minimizing the economic and social disruption of rapid German-style absorption. At face value, this is a sound proposal. However, there's at least 3 reasons why this gradual alternative doesn't make reunification prospects any better for South Korea. First, while gradualism may soften short-term adjustment costs, it's unlikely to reduce the overall burden of reunification to manageable levels. Deep institutional incompatibilities and extreme developmental gaps would still require large-scale wealth transfers, just spread over a longer period. Second, given the severity of South Korea's economic vulnerabilities, even a reduced fiscal burden is unlikely to be manageable. And finally, regardless of its impact on cost, gradual reunification is simply politically unrealistic.
Nope.
Gradualism retains all the same insecurities that make symmetric unification near impossible. These are risks that South Korea won't tolerate, and it was one of the reasons why West Germany pursued rapid absorption despite economic concerns. Now then, across all potential scenarios, far from a path to economic prosperity,
Stop the cap.
reunification is closer to a path to certain economic decline, if not crisis.
Oh, hell no.
Reunification through war obviously would be catastrophic. The most realistic pathway, rapid absorption, will almost certainly exceed South Korea's capacity. While even more optimistic, gradual alternatives offer limited cost relief and face severe political constraints. It's not just that reunification would be expensive, it's that South Korea's structural inability to manage the burden implies real human costs, especially for North Koreans, but also for South Koreans in the form of substantial decline in living standards and risk of economic crisis and social conflict. In the face of such costs, reunification cannot be seen as a desirable outcome. When evaluated as a national policy objective, South Korea's reunification goal fails both feasibility and desirability tests. I don't know about you guys, but I'd say there's a pretty strong case for South Korea to reconsider its reunification goal on these grounds alone. But given the enormous ideational significance of reunification, and the practical difficulties in changing it, South Koreans may still be hesitant to let go of it. Well, in part 2, I'll take my argument even further. I'll argue that reunification is not merely unrealistic and undesirable. South Korea's reunification goal is harmful even just as a distant objective. Even without achieving it, the reunification goal undermines some of the very outcomes it seeks: peace and prosperity.